Hello and welcome back to another episode of The Indie Side, where we talk to indie authors, editors and creatives in the indie community. Today I'm joined by Demi, who is an editor, author and wears many hats in the creative space. So Demi, introduce yourself.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be on your show, so thank you. And to everyone watching, hi, my name is Demi Michelle Schwartz. I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm an author. I primarily write young adult fiction. For novels, I only write young adult. I write fantasy and thriller, but I also write a lot of short stories that are found in anthologies. And for those, I write across genres and age categories because I think it's really fun to explore other things. Along with being an author, I'm an editor. I have my own freelance editing business called Amethyst Ink Editorial. I'm also an editor for RevPit, and I do anthology editing as well. On top of that, I am the host of a show called Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. And when I'm not busy in the publishing industry, I'm also an award-winning songwriter.
Wow, so as I said, so many things going on, which is why it's great to have you on. We could talk about
Yeah.
so many different spheres within the creative world. You kind of mentioned my first question, which is brilliant. You've talked about your work in the fantasy and the thriller genres, and that quite a lot of your work is aimed at young adults. So what drew you to those genres and those areas of writing?
Yeah, so I've always loved thrillers. Growing up, that's pretty much all I read, and that's mostly what I read now for fun. I just really love the thriller genre because I love darker fiction, I love the suspense, I love the twists and turns, and it's also really fun from the author side because whenever you're writing thrillers, especially when you have characters doing very dark and bad things, it really gets into psychology and thinking about like looking at that character as a real person and thinking about their motivations to make it realistic, even if it's twisted. And I think digging into the psychology of the characters, especially the villains, is super, super fun. As far as fantasy goes, this is a genre that I started exploring later. When I was in my MFA program, I had several critique partners who wrote fantasy, and that was when I really started to love the genre. And I thought I'd give it a try, and it turns out that I really love that genre as well, because the fantasy genre, unlike thriller, is full of like all the imagination, and you can do unrealistic things. You can have brand new worlds. You can have magic, and I think that's very fun because I'm also very imaginative, and I feel that I can be more imaginative in fantasy than thriller, especially because my thrillers are contemporary instead of the real world. And the other thing too is like with my fantasy, like because I love thrillers so much, I definitely bring thriller elements into fantasy. There's a lot of suspense. There's usually some kind of chicken clock element. And so even when I'm writing fantasy, I have the thriller part too.
Yeah, there's a lot to do with
Yeah.
both genres, in kind of opposite directions in one way, because there's so much world building and imagination in fantasy, and so much in the way of human nature and psychology to explore with thrillers. So
Mhm.
it's really interesting that you're mixing the two as well. And are there any other
Yeah.
genres that you really want to explore that you perhaps haven't done much with yet?
Um, Horror for sure. And I have done quite a few horror short stories. And I feel like horror is an adjacent genre to thriller in a way. And I love horror. I love a lot of horror books. And I've really enjoyed writing this kind of short stories. And so that's something I'm starting to explore. I'm not sure if I would ever write a complete YA horror or not, but in my current book I'm plotting right now, it's a gothic thriller. And so even though horror isn't the main genre, it's definitely the subgenre. It's actually inspired by one of Poe's stories, and it's set in this very like medieval vibe mansion. And so it's been really fun to pull horror elements into one of my thrillers, even though it's not a straight horror, but I really love horror in general.
Yeah, and that sounds really interesting because with the gothic side, there's a lot where you can lean into horror without necessarily going full on scary and full on gore. It
Mhm.
depends on kind of whether you want to take it as more like psychological horror or gothic horror. There's so many subgenres that you can use there, which gives you a
Yeah,
broad
for
scope of
sure.
work. So I know you.
Yeah, I love the psychological horror, quiet horror, supernatural too. I'm not a huge fan of like gory stuff, like and monsters. Like I'm more of like the on a personal level, like psychology, and I love supernatural stuff. So anything with like demonic possession and evil spirits and ghosts, like that's my
I
vibe.
can see that vibe tying into the thrillers as well, which makes sense because
hmm
that's where you're coming from originally. But now you do obviously have quite a broad scope of work, and I know you've written and submitted short stories for publication, you've done novellas, you've done novels. So, what sort of length of story do you prefer to write? What's your go to?
So I always will prefer novels. I just really love to develop full books and spend a lot of time with my characters, develop the worlds, have a very complex plot. So I will always prefer the novels. However, short stories are a ton of fun. My friends call me the anthology queen because I have an absolute obsession with submitting short stories to anthologies. And the reason why I love the short stories so much is because it allows me to consistently work on something new, especially if I'm like in between my novels, because I work on one book at a time, whether that's drafting or revising. And especially when I'm in revision stages, I'm not writing new material other than adding things to the book that's already created. And so, as an author, I think it's super, super important to continue to work my creative muscles and continue to create, even if I'm revising. And short stories is an amazing way to do that because I'm creating new stories, new material for shorter stories while I'm working on my longer ones.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I've done a lot of novels, and it's great to get the depth and to sit with the characters and the world, but short stories can be almost like a palate cleanser when you've just finished a long project and you want something a bit more manageable, or you just want to keep writing but you're not ready to start another full world yet.
Yeah, no, for sure. And like the other thing too is like I've gotten novel ideas from short stories that are in my doc of like book ideas. And so that's the other thing too. If you finish a book project and you're curious what you want to write next, writing some short stories and testing out ideas and just writing a short story for an anthology call and then getting the feeling that it could work for a longer novel, that's always super fun too.
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of room to grow short stories and to explore adjacent themes with them. And you've
Mhm.
mentioned a couple of projects that you're working on, like the Gothic story, but is there anything that we might see released or submitted soon?
So I have some short stories coming out this year, toward the end of the year. At the end of November, there is an anthology through Quill and Flame Publishing House called Seasons of Romantasy Winter. And I have a new adult romantasy in there called A Vow of Ice and Sapphires, which is really fun to write. And then toward the end of the year in December, I'm in Dragon Soul Press's holiday anthology called Holiday Spirit, and that story is called The Snow Globes of Tinsel Falls. And that was very fun to write because I'm calling it like a speculative romantic suspense. It's basically a big genre mashup. Like there's fantasy elements, there's horror elements, there's romance, there's suspense. And so I feel like speculative romantic suspense is the best classification for it, but it was really fun to write that because something else with short stories I love too is how experimental you can be. If you're writing a novel, especially if you're pursuing traditional publishing, you kind of have to see a very clear space for it to fit into the market. But when you're writing short stories like this, it's fun to take risks and like explore different things that you wouldn't in a novel, which is fun.
Yeah, you can kind of put all the genre conventions and
Mm-hmm.
hard, like marketable boxes to one side and do your own thing, which is a lot of fun. And it sounds like you've done that, and we're going to see some really cool holiday themed
Yeah.
stories coming out, which is always nice to see. So, we've talked a lot about everything that you do, writing, editing loads of things in the indie community, and the indie side is all about supporting all creatives, which I know you do a lot of. So I know, as well as being an author, you are a co-author with a friend of yours. So could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my best friend Jess and I co-author short stories together. We have a pen name, Sadie Liel, and it was fun coming up with that because Sadie, it has the S and A from her name, Jessica, has the D from my name, and then I and E from both. So it kind of combines our names. And then her middle name is Lee, and mine's Michelle. So we combined that for Liel. And it's been really fun to work with her. We met in undergrad and then we went to the same MFA program and we're critique partners there. And she also writes young adult. And so it's very fun to work on stories together. We've mostly done fantasy because that's the genre that she mainly focuses on. And so we have a few short stories already published and we're working on more. And it's really fun to co-author because looking at the stories, it's a blend of my voice and her voice. It's a combination of our ideas and we work really well together. And so we basically get on the phone, plot a story, figure out what we want to do, and then we split it in half. Like we have an outline and we decide who writes the first half and who writes the second half. And then after that, we revise it together so we can blend things and say she says something that is too different for like the voice of the story or I do that. We make those tweaks so the reader can't tell who wrote which part. It reads like one story. And so we focus a lot on revision to make sure that there isn't a sudden shift in the middle of the story where the voice changes. So it's been really fun to work with her, and I can't wait to write more stories with her.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely awesome. I know from working in writing groups or having writing friends that it's always so much fun to like brainstorm and bounce ideas about and things. So to do that with a fellow author must be a lot of fun as
Mm,
well. And then the fact that you can
yeah.
have like two authors create one book must be amazing, because I'd be so worried about
Yeah,
finding someone
Jess and
who like
I,
you couldn't match up with, but you seem to have a friendship
yeah.
already that makes it really work.
Yeah, Jess and I were talking about like at some point maybe doing a whole book together. And in that instance, it'd be really fun because we would do like dual point of view. So I would do one character and she would do one character, and the voices would naturally be different if you have two authors doing two different points of view. So we'll see if that happens down the road, but I think that'd be really fun.
It would definitely be a really cool experiment to see in the writing space, and it might inspire things for other authors as well. Another thing that I wanted to discuss that kind of ties into working with other authors, and will move us on to talking about your editing work as well, is RevPit, because we kind of met on social media, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it these days.
Twitter.
Yeah, that's my preferred term as well, but so nobody in the comments gets offended, I've used both. And I know that there's a lot of community led projects there that support authors and that have their own editors and are sort of centered around pitching. And that's what RevPit is one of. And you're quite heavily involved in that. But for people who haven't asked that before on social media, what is RevPit and how does it work?
So, first of all, I just want to say that I'm so grateful to be one of their editors. I participated in RevPit as an author in 2023 before I signed with my first agent. And it was really cool when they opened a application form for new editors. And I applied last year and joined. I love RevPit so much because it's very community focused. The main event is our annual contest that takes place in the spring, and it's more geared toward traditional publishing. However, I think it's definitely something that can be enlightening and fun for all authors. Essentially, you have a short window where you can submit your query letter, manuscript, and other materials to a form, and you can choose three of the RevPit editors to submit to. And then the editors read through all the submissions, and we choose one to do a full developmental edit with for about 8 weeks. And then after the 8 weeks, there's an agent showcase where the query letter and first 5 pages are posted on the RevPit website for agents to look at and request manuscripts. And so it's really fun because it's great if you win and you get a free developmental edit, but during the contest, there are many events going on. A huge one is called 10 Queries, and we actually did a mini event of that in October. And for that, we post generic feedback online of the query letter in first 5 pages, and it's almost like a game. Authors try to guess if you're talking about their submission or not, and they don't find out until after when we email them. But what I find so helpful about that could definitely apply to traditionally published authors or others pursuing self-publishing or with a small press, is the feedback is applicable to everything. So if you see feedback on a query letter and you're querying agents, you can apply that. However, if you look at like a blurb on Goodreads or the back of a cover if you're self-publishing, essentially a query letter's job and a blurb's job for a book are the same thing. They're structured a little differently, but they still have the same goals to hook a reader. And so if you're not pursuing traditional publishing, you can still use the feedback that the editors give on the query letters for your blurb. And you can especially use the feedback editors give on your first 5 pages, because whether you're going with an agent or self-publishing or a small press, your first 5 pages are equally important. So I love the 10 Queries event, and just the community aspect as well. The authors do a fun event called Rev Pit Waiting, and that's during the waiting period when the editors are reading submissions. And I've seen tons of authors make friends through interacting with others. I've made a ton of friends through Rev Pit when I participated as an author. And we try to keep things going all year round. In November, we have it's called Fall into Fiction. It's newer. I believe they started it last year for the first time. And there's sprints, there's like Ask Editor chats, there's a ton of things to gain information about publishing and writing. So I would definitely recommend for everybody to check it out. Their website is reviseresub.com. I'm almost 100% sure. But if you search Revise and Resubmit or Revise and Resub or Refit, you will definitely see it. But it's a fabulous event, and I definitely recommend it to everybody. Check it out.
Yeah, it sounds like it has the two main things that I think all authors' spaces need, which is feedback, which is crucial to all authors. Even if you're doing it the indie way, you still need to get other eyes, other voices, and community, because writing can be kind of isolating when you're just sat there doing the actual writing part all day, every day. So just having the chats and the constant talking to other editors, other authors, agents, whoever it is that you particularly want to connect with, it's great to be able to find them online and connect in that space. So as well as being an author, as well as doing RevPit, we've talked about your editing, but you also have a freelance editing business, is that correct? So what got you started with your editing?
So for that, I fell in love with critiquing other authors' work when I was in my MFA program. I had critique partners, and during our in-person residencies, we had workshops where we basically were given the first 10 pages of everyone in the group, whether that's from a short story or a novel, and we read it before residency, and then we all sat in a circle and verbalized our feedback. And what I gained so much from my program is not only being able to give feedback well, but being able to do so in a written form and verbally. And that inspired me once I started doing it with the Sync editorial to offer bonus calls for authors to ask me questions, just to have that verbal communication too. But as far as starting editing, after I graduated from my MFA program, I started querying for the first time, and I had a lot of friends who were also querying. And so we did beta reading swaps and gave each other feedback. And several of my friends who I swapped with quickly got agents, some self-published, and many times they were like, you should be a freelance editor. And I'm like, I don't know if anyone will pay me to edit their book. I don't know. So I put it off for a long time, and then people kept telling me this. So I started in with this editorial in March of 2024, and it's been an absolute dream job. I love all the authors I get to work with. I love all their books. It's such an honor to be part of their journeys, and it's really special for me because I've worked with authors who have self-published, Several of my authors have signed with agents and small presses. And just recently, which was the coolest thing so far, one of the coolest things is there was an author I worked with who got an agent and then a publishing deal. And I didn't know this until I saw the announcement in Publisher's Lunch. And that was like the coolest thing to see the title of a book I worked on last year in Pub Lunch. So it's been really special to be part of authors' journeys. I think editors are magical. All the editors I've worked with have definitely helped me get to where I am now. And so, yeah, I love it. And Three with the Sink, I do short stories, novellas, full manuscripts. I also do partials to the first 5, 10, or 50 pages. And then I also do query letters.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Editors are magical. They're worth their weight in gold to have a good editor. And like you mentioned, whether you go self-pub or whether you go traditional, whether you go small press, whatever direction you take your work in, you need an editor. You need somebody to have seen it who is professional. And as far as the experience goes, I also did creative writing at university. So those workshops are just really brilliant to get feedback as a writer and also to learn to give feedback, whether you're doing it professionally or whether you're just planning to practice or even just for reviewing the books that you read in daily life. It's good to have the experiences. So, when it comes to editing, are you sort of drawn to the same genres and styles and manuscripts that you write yourself, or is it a mixture?
I get everything. I pretty much do anything except for, and I'm just on my website too, I don't do science fiction because I personally don't read that and I don't feel I have the level of knowledge to be able to do a good job on science fiction. However, I do like dystopian fiction, so that's different. But if it's like high sci-fi and you're in space and all that stuff's going on, probably not a fit for me. I also struggle with historical fiction, straight historical fiction. If you have like a mystery with like a historical timeline, or if your fantasy is historical, that's different. But like if it's just historical fiction, I don't really have experience with that either. Other than that, pretty much open to anything. I do middle grade, young adult, and adult across genres. At this point, I've pretty much edited every genre that I would do and all different styles. Sometimes I'll read, like especially if I'm reading a YA fantasy or a YA thriller, can be some similarities to mine and my voice, but all the stories are so original and so unique. And that's one of the really cool things about being an editor is when I'm sent a manuscript, I have no clue what I'm going to be reading. And so every day the job's different and that's super fun.
Yeah, that must be the fun part of just seeing everything that's out there, all these amazing ideas. But I understand where you're coming from with different genres, have different conventions and different levels of knowledge that you need. So obviously if that's not your background or your specialist subject, it can be hard to edit that. Another thing when it comes to being difficult to edit, is it hard sometimes to separate your personal preferences in writing and reading from what you need to give as to the author as feedback?
I'm really happy you mentioned this because this is something I'm extremely aware of. And this is something that I think is super important for authors to keep in mind, even if they're beta reading for a friend. It's so important for me to be as objective as I possibly can. Of course, like we all have our own like perspectives to reading, which is why publishing is so subjective. However, there's a difference between giving feedback that's your opinion based on craft elements or the way the story's going, and giving feedback based on your own preferences. I do not give feedback based on my own personal preferences because I don't think that's helpful and that's not what the author needs to hear. So I'm going to give you an example. Hypothetically, if an editor is reading a book and they do not like the trope of, say, forced proximity in romance. If they're reading a book and there's a forced proximity romance, then they might be compelled to like leave comments like, oh, I don't think this is working here because XYZ, or maybe you should pick a different trope because blah, blah, blah. And like, that's not constructive criticism because That's somebody reading a book and saying, this isn't working because it's not my cup of tea, or I wouldn't do this because I would do it this way. That's not an editor's job, and it's not a beta reader's job either. My job as an editor and as a beta reader for my friends is to look at what the author's doing and to understand their vision and help them realize that and help them get their book to the level that they want it to be at and staying true to their voice in their story. It's extremely, I'm going to say damaging, because it's happened to me, where you get feedback and the person is kind of ripping it apart in a way that's, it's so overly subjective that it's like they don't like anything in the story because they don't like this trope and they don't like that trope, and I'm like, that's not what I asked you. I didn't ask you if you like the trope. And when you do stuff like that, it can be extremely difficult for an author to take the feedback. I've dealt with feedback for a real long time, so I handle it well and then move on. However, if an author is sending their work to somebody for the first time, and that's the very first time they're getting feedback, and they get something back that's all subjective and all personal opinion, and it's not helpful at all, that could be extremely discouraging. That can make them give up on the story. That can make them feel afraid to work with an editor again, or hire another editor, or work with a beta reader. And so I always try to suggest for anyone reading somebody else's work to separate your personal preferences from your natural reactions to the story. If a character element isn't working because it's just not working in the story, if you think that character needs more development, that's totally fine, and that's helpful feedback. But if the character is, say, a fairy and you don't like fairies, that's not helpful feedback. So that's something I feel really passionate about. So yeah, I'm really happy you asked that.
Yeah, I agree. I know it can be difficult to remain subjective, especially when you're used to pleasure or when you're a writer yourself and you have opinions. But I've had similar to the scenario you said, where there was a lot of tension between the main couple in my story for plot reasons, and I had a beta reader who left me negative feedback because he liked happy endings and he didn't want the couple to be fighting. Well, that's not really what I was asking him about. I was hoping he would sort of tell me, does the story work? Does it make sense? Is there any glaring plot hole that I've left in? Basic feedback about the structure and the story and the style, rather than his opinion on how the story should end.
Yeah. No, for sure. There's a difference. Like, the differences between you understanding the author's vision and helping them to develop their story to fit that vision, and you looking at it and thinking of all the ways you would have done things differently to fit your personal preferences, and that's where you don't want to go as an editor.
Yeah, and it's difficult, I understand that, but that's where, as an author and an editor, it comes into figuring out who is and isn't a good fit for you before you make a contract or agree to work together. Speaking of working with authors, as a freelance editor, so you're not sort of affiliated with any company except your own, do you find it hard to find work just doing it for yourself?
So far, no. And I think the reason is because I did it for about, I want to say, like, almost a whole 2 years before I actually started freelance editing. So when I started freelance editing, all of the authors I worked with prior to that wrote me testimonials, and they would just start referring me to their friends. And so right when I started Amethyst Ink, I pretty much got people right away. And I know that's not necessarily the norm. I'm really thankful for that. But I think another part that played into having success right away was I launched my podcast, Literary Blend, basically in partnership with Amethyst Ink. So basically what I did was, during the first week of the show, anybody who rated or reviewed the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts got a free first 10 pages critique. That gave me a ton of work, but what it did do is a ton of those authors hired me for more, and a few of those authors I still consistently work with over a year later. And so I do love to do giveaways from time to time too. I donate to things like the Literary Auction of Change. I've donated to the Kidlit Chuckle Challenge and a few other things. So I think giving back is super important. And so I always try to find those opportunities to give prizes for those contests, to help authors who maybe can hire an editor if they win. And so consistently doing that and just staying active in the publishing industry has helped. And so, yeah, I haven't found it extremely difficult yet, but I'm sure at some point there will be a time where it gets hard, because I feel like that happens for everyone at some point. But for now, things are going pretty well.
That's great to hear. Like you said, all jobs have their ups and downs, but it sounds like having loyal clients from early on and the testimonials and good connections with communities has really helped to establish a consistent base of
Mm.
people who come back and still work with you, which is fabulous to hear. You mentioned that you've worked with both indie and traditionally published authors and that you've supported authors in their publishing journey as well as actually the manuscript itself. What does that involve for you?
So it's interesting because when I'm editing a manuscript, to me, like, I don't see that much of a difference whether the author is pursuing traditional publishing or they're going to self-publish or go with a small press, because the book is still what matters. And so by keeping that in mind, I approach every book equally. And if you're pursuing traditional publishing, that's not superior to self-publishing, it's just a different path. And so the book is the book, and I'm going to edit it the same way I would no matter what path. What I will say though is if I know for 100% certain that the author is pursuing traditional publishing and they want to get an agent, there are some things that you definitely need to be aware of. You can get away with more things if you're self-publishing or going with a small press, because especially with small presses now, they're more willing to take on books of certain genres or topics and things that traditional publishers like Big Five or Midsize might be a little more hesitant to take on. And there might be some elements in the books that could make agents hesitant to take books on. And so if I'm editing a book and I come across something like that and I know the author wants to sign with an agent, I will just let them know. I'm not telling them you have to change this, because that's not my decision to make, that's theirs. But I will make a note saying, hey, like, this might be a little bit of a hard sell because of this reason. This is just something to be aware of. It doesn't mean it won't sell to an agent. I'm just saying that this might be an obstacle you might have to overcome. Or if there's an element in the story that might be a little problematic and I point that out, I say maybe if you cut this, it will give you a better shot with an agent. But if this element of the story is really important to you, you do not need to cut it at all. And so it's always the author's choice, but I think it's important to make them aware of things, because especially when I started querying the first time, there were things that I wish I would have known before, and it wasn't until I started to work with a lot of authors and became friends with agents and stuff where I really understood, and just from my own experiences querying as well. And so having that knowledge now, I think it's really great, and it's really nice to be able to pass that along to someone so they know ahead of time, instead of going through the whole situation and realizing, oh no, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And so any way I can help authors avoid those kind of situations, I try to. But at the end of the day, it's their book and they can do whatever they want.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree that, and I'm glad you mentioned that there is no superior path, they're all equal, because obviously here the indie side is mostly about indie authors who have either self published or gone with a small press, but there's nothing wrong with traditional publishing as well. I think the reason I see most indies who've made that decision, the reason it's come up a lot on these episodes, is exactly what you said. It's people thinking that, oh, my story isn't that marketable, it's not what agents or publishers are looking for, it's either a niche genre or it's a genre mashup, or they want to do something that just isn't an easy sell to traditional publishers, so they go with the indie route, which is a great choice as well if that's a story you want to tell. But like you said, it's the story that comes first, and that's the author's personal decision of how they tell that and how they choose to then sell the story.
Yeah, no, for sure. And That's one of the things too that I would suggest for authors to think about the path you want to pursue, and whatever feels right for you is the path to go. There is a lot of stuff online sometimes with people kind of arguing over superior paths, which to me, like, that's not cool because every path is valid. There are different reasons authors want to get published. If your goal is to be on the New York Times bestseller list and you want to do a book tour and you want to be with HarperCollins, then you need an agent. But if your goal is, I just want to hold a book in my hands and I want to be able to see my words in print, and I don't really care if I sell a million copies. I don't want to be famous. I just want to live the life as an author, then you don't necessarily need to pursue traditional publishing. And so I think doing some reflecting on your own personal goals and what's best for you and your story is so important. And don't listen to all the noise and what people are saying, because you have to do what's right for you.
Exactly, and that was kind of one of the next things I wanted to discuss is the pros and cons of different routes, but as you see them when people come to you for editing, so the pros and cons of trad and indie for an editor to work with.
I don't necessarily think there's like a pro or con situation with the editing specifically, because I'm just focusing on their book. And so whatever route they want to take, whatever publisher they want to send their book to, or agent, or if they want to self-publish it, that's their choice. And so I don't necessarily see pros and cons with the editing, other than it's not necessarily a con, but what I said before about having elements and things in your book that might be hard sells for agent, point those out, which could be, I guess you can see it as a con for traditional if you have to make some choices that you don't necessarily want to make, but you know will make it more marketable. But in terms of just the editing itself, I don't really see much of a difference because I'm focusing on the story.
Yeah, that's always a relief to hear because the story should come first, and often you
Mm-hmm.
see traditional publishing and indie routes pitted against each other as well. This one has all the success, or if you do it this way, well, that's wrong. But I don't think it comes down to that so long as you get to tell your story and, like you said, pursue whatever goal you have with that story.
Oh, the one thing I wanted to add real quick is readers aren't even like necessarily aware of like even who the publisher is. If they find a good book, they're gonna read it. And I think I did see something, I think it was last year, somebody did some kind of survey where they asked author or readers, do they like even know who published the book when they go to read it? And a huge percent said no. So if an author stumbles upon a book that connects with them, they're not going to care if it's published by a small press or Simon and Schuster. They're going to buy it anyways. And so that's why I think this discourse surrounding independent publishing and traditional publishing is wild to me, because the readers don't care. The only real, like, one of the main benefits with traditional publishing, obviously, is the greater reach and the distribution. And it's a little more likely that a reader will come across a book that was traditionally published versus self-published or with a small press. However, if you do the marketing and you build your connections and you get the book out there, then it will find the readers either way. And so it really comes down to the story and focusing on the story. That's what matters.
Yeah, I agree because honestly, I think a lot of things that authors worry about, a lot of the big hang ups from the author side, come from spending too much time talking to other authors and to editors and people within publishing and not actually from readers, because a lot of the things that you spend the most time stressing about as a writer are actually nothing to do with what readers think. And even me myself, I could recognize that as a reader, I wouldn't care about certain things, but then as a writer, I'm
Yeah.
overthinking it and being like, "Oh no, do I have to do it this way because of this?" Or you just get in your own head about it, and actually, quite a lot of the time, it does not matter.
Yeah, for sure.
So not quite last question, but one of the last things I wanted to ask before we close is you've left us with quite a lot to think about, a lot of profound words on publishing in general. Do you have any advice for either aspiring authors or people who want to get into editing, or both?
So, what I will say is I'll say one for being an author and one for being an editor. The one I have for being an author is to write the book you want to read and don't worry about what's trending. I know that when trends hit, like everyone wants to write a romantasy, or everybody wants to write a vampire story, or pirates really hit real hard recently this year. Like everybody wanted pirate books. And if you are like, I'm not a pirate person, I don't want to write a pirate book, don't write it just because that's what's hot. And also don't write it because by the time you write the book and you publish it or queer it or whatever, that trend is going to be on. And so I always say to write the book you want to read and the one you want to write, while being mindful of the market that you're trying to reach. And this is something that I did not necessarily do when I started, that I'm 100% doing now. Because I'm pursuing traditional publishing, I know there are certain conventions I need to keep in mind. And when I'm writing the book that I want to read, I'm tailoring that to what traditional publishing would want. And so I'm not sacrificing my ideas necessarily of writing something like, personally, like I said before, I'm not a sci-fi person. So if sci-fi all of a sudden took off and everybody wanted space novels, that wouldn't be authentic to me. So I'm not going to write that. But I'm going to write my young adult fantasies and thrillers over here because that's what's authentic to me. But I'm doing it in a way where I'm aware of the market, I'm aware of what's selling, I'm aware of what editors are typically looking for. I know what has been overdone to try to do something more original. So being mindful of the market you want to get into is great, because then you can take your idea that you're passionate about and tailor that to either traditional publishing or whatever readers you're hoping to reach. And then for getting into editing, just from my own personal experience when I started and seeing how I was able to get clients right away, is to network authentically. If you connect with the right people, then then authors and other people in publishing will get to know you, and they will also organically get to know your services. I see sometimes people promote a lot, like if they don't have someone or if they're just getting started, like it becomes like really like over the top marketing and like a little over the top promo-y. And sometimes that can turn people away because it's like, hire me, hire me, hire me. You know what I mean? But if you make the genuine connections and you have people who have worked with you and you announce like you're opening 2 bookings again, I guarantee you that the people you've worked with will post like, hey, I worked with this person, you should check them out, or referring to their friends, because that's what happens to me without me even having to say like, I need people. And so I think the authenticity really, really comes through. And that's so important because especially if you're going to be hiring an editor, there's 2 things you got to keep in mind. One is your money you're paying that person. And 2, you're trusting them with your book. And so all the editors that I've personally worked with are people I already knew. I knew their personalities. I knew they were good people. And I knew people who have worked with them that had good things to say. And so if someone hoping to be an editor is very active in the community and you let authors see who you are as a person and all the things, then I think you will naturally get people gravitating toward you.
Yeah, I think the key point there for both editors and authors is being true to yourself. So, being true to the story you want to tell, or being true to your personality when you network, when you meet people, which is both powerful advice for everyone in the community. Before we wrap it up, is there anything you wanted to mention? Any shout outs, any closing comments you have for us?
I just want to thank you for having me on the show. And I would just love to give a shout out to all my friends and everyone in the writing community who are absolute gems. This year has been quite the ride. having to queer again and everything. And I am just really grateful for all the support that I've had over this past year. And so, just thanks to everyone. I'm super blessed to be part of the community as an author and an editor, and I can't wait to keep at it.
Yeah, the writing community and the just general creative community is absolutely amazing for support, and I'm glad you've had that this year. And on behalf of myself and the indie side in general, thank you for coming today. It's been wonderful to talk to you,